Okay, I can't see any of you, but that's okay. Everyone can see this okay? Luke, you can just say yes or,
Yeah, looks good.
yeah, okay, great. Okay, thanks everyone. This is really great and I'm very glad we've been able to reconvene with such a large group with lots of new faces, but I just looked through the participant list. There's lots of people who were involved in the making of this particular effort. Like many of us dealing with the pandemic and many tasks, this has been kind of set aside to some extent, but this meeting has really allowed me to dig back into this project. And so I'm hoping today to present this work in its current state, beginning with a conceptual framework and leading into ideas for an empirical version. And I just want to make a note too. I sent this out to the original group that was working on this framework that we're hoping to have a meeting next Tuesday at around this time. So I'll be sending a follow-up email about that to try to finalize this first paper. So today I'm going to talk a bit about this to the group. This is an idea we had about a flexible, replicable invasibility framework for urban green spaces. And we've heard already about some of the diversity in urban green spaces, both within and across green space type. So this is just a list of the group 11 members who really helped with this project. So thanks so much for your continued contributions to the discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing from more of you. Now, this all began back when we were deciding our working groups, and as group 11, we were really interested in this question of invasibility, right? The likelihood of invasion, and whether or not this was equal across urban green spaces. This got us really going on the chalkboard. We probably all miss chalkboards, writing out all the different ways in which urban green spaces differ and how this may be important for their invasibility. Now, invasibility, as I already mentioned, is the likelihood of being invaded, right? So this is going to depend on a variety of attributes. And important here is that it's preventative and proactive. So many of us are looking for decision-making tools to prevent invasions before the economic costs of managing them sets in. And this work was in part inspired by a really great paper by Gua et al. In 2015, which disentangled invasibility from the degree of invasion. What you can see in this graph is that a particular plot or urban green space that has a low invasibility will have a low degree of invasion. However, if it has a high degree of invasibility, it could have a low or a high degree of invasion. And so this work was done in a number of forest ecosystem plots, and it led to a really nice way of measuring invasibility. Why should we care about invasibility in urban environments? As I've already mentioned, this proactive effort can identify likely points of entry for new invaders, determine locations for future invasive spread, and it can help us locate corridors or stepping stones that increase invader movement. And Basil already mentioned a little bit of that with the stormwater ponds. So in that regard, urban green spaces, as I've mentioned, are very diverse, and there's continual redefining of what an urban green space is. For the sake of this conceptual framework, we refer to urban green space as any unpaved area that supports vegetation. And so this is just a small subset of possible urban green spaces. And important here in acknowledging, even just by looking at these photos, is there's variation in the invasive plant species that are present in different types of urban green spaces. And this is supported by other studies that have looked at the plant community composition in a variety of urban green spaces in different studies. So why should we care about invasibility of urban green spaces? Well, I mentioned a few points that extend broadly to any kind of green space. But what's really important about urban green spaces is they exist in association with this practitioner to researcher continuum. So researchers are continually attempting to improve the design, the ecosystem functioning, the resilience to invasion of urban green spaces. and practitioners are those tasked with both the design, implementation, and the management of these spaces. And so a framework that allows us to investigate invasibility across different urban green spaces would be valuable for these 4 questions, which I won't have a lot of time to get into now. But these have really inspired and driven us to seek a framework to address this particular set of questions. So, how does prevention of plant invasions differ across urban green spaces? How do we balance the need for invasibility with other important urban green space functions? What characteristics of urban green spaces allow them to be a barrier for invasion spread? And how do socioeconomic and socio-ecological factors that drive invasion vary across urban green spaces? So a framework would allow us to address these kinds of questions as researchers. So in developing this framework, we relied heavily on a really great one developed by Jane Catford in 2009. In this framework, the authors reviewed 29 different hypotheses and distill down invasion being a result of 3 primary categories. And those are propagule pressure, abiotic factors, and biotic factors. And in the paper, they represented these as this Venn diagram, where in the center of these overlapping circles is where invasion occurs. The size of each circle is the extent of its contribution, and the darkening of these circles indicates its strength. So this was really inspiring for us as well, as we veered towards developing a framework that can be used to compare between urban green spaces. Important here in looking at invasibility is we don't know the identity of the invader just quite yet. And so we initially began this road through this conceptual framework by not thinking about the invader per se, but thinking about the properties of the urban green spaces in question. And how we began to visualize this is through what you see here, a studio mixer, right? One that would be used in recording of music and other media, where as you move that toggle up and down or down and up from that mixer channel, we see a higher contribution to invasibility. And each of these channels represent different factors which can be grouped across these 3 pillars of the Catford framework: propagule pressure, abiotic, and biotic. Now, the list that we have here is not complete, of course. This is simply a flexible example. And by no means is this a comprehensive list, but as practitioners and research tasked with this work, one can identify what are the most important factors to, or what factors are available that can be measured. Now, the ones that I've illustrated here could be measured along a continuous scale, but of course, many factors might be binary or discrete categories. And we've tried to maintain flexibility in our framework to adapt to those differences in the data that are available. So I've animated this a little bit to illustrate my point. So here we have our channels in our mixer. The toggles are all set at 0. And as we move through different urban green spaces, we see these toggles move based on the information available. And as these circles within the Venn diagram expand, they're indicating the importance to invasibility. Remember that we're not as interested in that center overlap of the Venn diagram indicating invasion, because at this point, we're really interested in the likelihood of invasion. And so doing this very simple exercise, practitioners might be able to identify what is the core pillar driving invasibility in this particular urban green space. And again, this is fairly qualitative, but it gives insight into practitioners, allows for kind of proactive management and adaptations to existing management plans. And it allows us to ask a basic question, which I began with: is invasibility different between urban green spaces? I mean, I'd like to think that all of us are on the same page and would agree that the diversity and a degree of differences across urban green spaces would result in there being these differences. But as we continue down this kind of conceptualization of invasibility across urban green spaces, one might ask, well, okay, as a practitioner or as a researcher, as a practitioner managing multiple types of urban green spaces over a particular area, or as a researcher interested in prioritizing questions, we may want to compare across urban green spaces. So here we've illustrated this with an ordination plot with vectors that represent the different factors contained within each pillar. And as we move along here, different urban green spaces are being plotted in this ordination plot to a point where we have, a few dozen illustrated here. And these are grouped by color based on urban green space type. And you can see here in this illustration that some urban green spaces tend to cluster. Some urban green space types tend to cluster, whereas others are more scattered across this ordination plot. So for example, home gardens, we've illustrated here as being scattered across the area, and that reflects the great diversity in the ways in which these spaces are managed by individual people and so forth. So again, this is purely conceptual, and these data this is a mock data. So preparing this distance-based ordination, we can begin to determine the relative extent and strength of each pillar and each factor for invasibility in ways that allow us to guide practitioner decision-making. But of course, this is entirely conceptual, not based on real data at this point. In order to test this particular framework, we may need to actually go out to these green spaces and identify the invasive species that are present there and record some measure of invasion level. Maybe it's richness or diversity or abundance. And in doing that, we can then integrate this into this ordination plot here, and whereby each circle, the larger the circle, the greater the invasion level. And using a constrained ordination approach, we can begin to identify which of these factors these factors and which pillars are most important for invasibility across urban green spaces. So this actually was planned to collect these data from urban green spaces across a region in Toronto, but this was, of course, interrupted by COVID. We do still plan to attempt to collect these types of data within the lab, but we would be also interested in pursuing maybe a mock data set, or if anyone within the GUBIC community might have some ideas, that would be great. And then finally, the next step is, of course, to link plant traits. So I mentioned early on that the Catford framework used plant traits to identify invasion level. We did not use that in the invasibility approach, but in surveying each of these urban green spaces for invasive and non-native plant species, we can use various databases to link plant traits to each pillar or each factor, so that we can predict which species are likely invaders for different urban green spaces. So with that, we have this first conceptual framework almost completed. There is this need for an empirical test of the framework, whether or not that needs to be included in an initial manuscript or separated out. That's a discussion point I think we can have. Linking plant traits to the factors and the pillars is another idea that we have moving forward. And further down the line, evaluating this at a regional level. So how do multiple urban green spaces within a region, their composition and configuration, how might that influence invasibility over larger scales? And there's been discussions about looking at this across cities as well. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And again, I'm really happy to be part of this symposium. Thanks very much, everyone.